Okay, we are now recording, so sorry for the glitch. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Lecture 3 in the Politics of Religion. And in the previous two lectures, we've been talking about some of the conceptual and theoretical issues involved in the study of religion. And one of the key points to come out of this, particularly if you can cast your mind back to Lecture 1, is that there are different ways in which we can conceptualize religion. And one way to do this is to look at it substantively. So this is considering religion in terms of the ideas and the beliefs and the doctrines, let's say, that religions have about the way in which reality works. Or we can consider religion functionally by looking at it in terms of the social cohesion that it brings about, the kind of wider consequences, providing people with a sense of purpose and meaning in their lives and so on. Or, which was the third approach that we discussed, you can consider religion discursively. So this is the idea that religion isn't an objective thing out there in the universe waiting to be discovered, but is a discursive process that is continually being remade and renegotiated. Now I'm going to come back to the discursive view later in the module, but for the next 2 weeks I'm going to dig into the substantive and the functional definitions of religion a bit more, starting today with the substantive view, looking at the relationship between religion and science. And this is the plan. First of all, if everything works out as it should, which would be nice, I'm going to talk about the main models about this relationship, which broadly break down into conflict and harmony models. Then I'm going to consider some of the evidence for and against these different approaches. And then finally, I'm going to talk a bit about the way in which these debates about religion and science are political. Because very often they can seem to be some kind of intellectual exercise in, which side's got the better explanation. And the politics of all of this can sometimes be a bit overlooked. So, one of the most popular ways of describing the link between science and religion was devised by this chap, Ian Barber, who devised 4 main models. These are, as you can see, the conflict model, the independence model, and then the dialogue and the synthesis models. So the first of these is the conflict thesis, or the conflict model. And essentially, this sees science and religion as being pitted against each other in some kind of grand cosmic fight to the death, like King Kong versus Godzilla. Obviously, Godzilla would be science in this analogy, because you all know Godzilla, right, for reasons. Although, yes, and I do get then the last King Kong versus Godzilla movie, it did end up teaming up together to fight a mechanized version of Godzilla. So the analogy doesn't completely work, but broadly in this description, I'm talking about the conflict between them, right? So just forget about the last film, it wasn't even that good. So this is the conflict thesis, science and religion in perpetual battle to the death. And this idea was popularized during the late 19th century by 2 people in particular. One was John William Draper, as you can see here, wrote a famous book on the history of the conflict between religion and science, which is a bit of a clue as to what it's about. And then another guy called Andrew Dickinson White, who wrote a similarly titled piece of work. And so sometimes when you read about this topic, you can find the conflict thesis being described as the Draper-White thesis, because this is where it comes from. And the central claim here is that science and religion are fundamentally different ways of gaining knowledge about and understanding the world. So religion understands the world through revelations, whether it's revelations in holy texts or whether it's people's personal experiences or some idea of supernatural communications like visions, for example. Science understands the world through empirical observation. So science will form hypotheses, they will conduct measurable experiments, you can test the results of these experiments will be replicable, other people can go and conduct the same experiments and see if they get the same results and so on. generally known as the scientific method. So there's two completely different ways of interrogating reality and of understanding the way in which reality works. Now, supporters of the conflict thesis, which includes the new atheists, like Richard Dawkins, but also this guy, who you probably haven't heard of. This was a guy called Victor Stenger, who was sometimes considered to be one of the new atheists, but he wasn't really one of the core new atheists. He was one of these sort of floating around the edge a little bit. They will argue that the scientific method is innately superior, and that religious claims about the world have been consistently shown to be wrong, as you can see in this particular quote. Victor Stenger, by the way, also wrote a book called God, the Failed Hypothesis, in which he treated the idea of God, treated religious claims about the existence of God as a scientific test, and then went out and looked at the evidence for this, and in his view, it didn't work, so it was a failed hypothesis. So the point being that from the conflict thesis, this approach, in particular the new atheists, will treat religion as making truth claims about reality that can be tested. And when they're tested, then people from this side will say they don't work, right? So religion fails and science wins. And some common examples of this, which you'll know at least a couple of them, are, first of all, we've got the belief in geocentrism. This was the view that the Earth was the centre of the universe, which was quite popular for a while. This was the view of the Christian Church until it was disproven by the Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus in 1543, and then Galileo a bit later on in 1632, for which the famous story of Galileo is that he disproved the geocentric model of the universe and then was put under house arrest for his troubles, which is kind of half true. He did also write some stuff making fun of the Pope, which wasn't the smartest thing to do at the time. So it was a little bit of that and a little bit of this. But anyway, he ended up in trouble. And of course, the geocentric view of the universe has been proven to be wrong. The second thing that often crops up is the belief that the Earth is only a few thousand years old, which is a view which is quite popular with young Earth creationists. Both Christian and Muslim religions have this young Earth idea of creationism. This came, by the way, from this idea that it was about 6,000 years old, came from a bishop called Ussher, and he got this figure by going through the Bible and adding up all the ages of all the characters and all of the different events that took place and trying to work out the timeline. And when he did this, he arrived at a figure of about 6,000 years. So he said, well, there you go, the Earth is 6,000 years old. This was then disproven from the 18th century by people like James Hutton, who is on the left here, and Sir Charles Lyell, who is in the middle, who were geologists, and through their work they proved that the Earth was actually quite a bit older than 6,000 years. And I think Charles Lyell came up with this idea of deep time to try to conceptualize it, just because it was unfathomably old. Okay, then we've got, well, you'll know this one. Of course, this is the idea that humans were directly created by God. This idea was undermined, although in some people's view, proven or not proven, we'll see a bit later on, a bit more about this, was undermined at least by Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, The Origin of Species being published in the mid-19th century. And then fourthly, supporters of the conflict thesis also claim, but you might have heard this phrase as well, it's the God of the gaps, right? This is the claim that religious explanations of reality are being driven back by science. So as the realm of science expands, as science explains more and more and more things, religion's got less to fall back on. So religion used to be able to claim how the universe worked, and it used to be able to claim the age of the Earth, and it used to be able to claim about evolution. It can't do any of those things anymore, so it's reduced to ever smaller and smaller slices of reality. And the argument here is that these are things that essentially science can't prove, or at least can't prove yet, and so God then gets inserted as the explanation. So that would be things like the Big Bang. Like, what happened before the Big Bang? Science will say, don't know. Maybe there isn't an explanation, maybe we'll never know. So the religious side can then come in and go, God did it, right? Or how did life begin? Nobody knows. So religion can then say, God did it. But those areas where religion can lay claim to this are becoming smaller and smaller, and this is the God of the gaps explanation. Now, at this point, it should be noted that quite a lot of people, as you might have gathered at this point, who subscribe to the conflict thesis are quite anti-religious, like the New Atheists, or at least sort of, ambivalent about religion, right? But you can find quite a lot of people on the religious side who also subscribe to the conflict thesis. And this is typically from the creationist side or the fundamentalist side of the religious spectrum. People like this guy here, who I don't know if you might have heard of him. If you haven't heard of him, his name's Ken Ham. You should definitely go and look him up because he's quite a character. And you can see quite a few of his videos on YouTube, for example. He runs a thing in Kentucky called the Ark Encounter, where they built what they imagine to be a life-sized actual replica of Noah's Ark, and it's all about the creation story, right? He also runs a website which I think is called Answers in Genesis, which purports to claim, people go along with questions and they say things like, well, in fact, this is one of the things you should look up. They'll say, his view is that the Bible is literally true. And if the Bible is literally true, then science has to be wrong, right? And if the Bible is literally true, then one of the questions is, well, what about dinosaurs, right? Because Adam and Eve were alive, and dinosaurs would have been alive at the same time. And his answer is, well, yes. So then, well, why weren't they eaten by the dinosaurs? Dinosaurs were quite, some of them quite fierce creatures. Adam and Eve, not very... not very, they didn't know like the art of self-defense, let's say. They could have been eaten by the dinosaurs. Why weren't they? And his answer to this, and I am not making this up, but don't take my word for it, go and look it up for yourself. The answer to this from Ken Ham is that dinosaurs were vegetarian. And they were vegetarian because this was before Adam and Eve were ejected from the Garden of Eden, right? This was before the fall, before the corruption of humankind and everything else. And it was only with the corruption of the fall that people then started becoming carnivorous. So until that point, they were safe because T-Rex was wandering around just looking for a plant burger and didn't chase them. But anyway, point being that you can find people on the religious side who also like this idea of a conflict between science and religion because they think that religion is going to win. Now on this side, you typically find arguments from design. And there are two different types of these. One is called the cosmological argument from design, and the other type is a sort of biological arguments from design. So the cosmological arguments will claim that, well, there's a couple of variants of these, but the most popular one will claim that the universe, such as it is and such as we know about it, could not have possibly come into being without some kind of designer behind it. Because if you look at the different elements that go to make up the universe. You look at all the different laws, like the law of electromagnetism, the force of gravity, all of these things. If they're just ever so slightly different, like if you work out what the electromagnetic force is, and you it's like 0.0000 whatever it is, and then you kind of you go like 10 down, and then you start to change it even slightly, the universe as we know it is completely different, right? You don't get stars forming. If you don't get stars, you don't get carbon. If you don't get carbon, you don't get carbon-based life forms, and we don't exist. So the universe seems to be remarkably fine-tuned, is the phrase, for the existence of life. And so, put in this way, it seems completely implausible to believe that it could have happened by random chance. All of the dials have got to be in just the right place for the universe to happen. Therefore, it seems quite reasonable to infer that there's some kind of design behind it. We get a similar thing in the biological case. This is where you find arguments from intelligent design, which is particularly popular in the United States. And one of the features of intelligent design is this idea of irreducible complexity. And this claims that you look at organs like the liver or the lungs or eyes, for example, and it's completely impossible to believe that they could have evolved completely, because the eye requires, a retina, requires the gelatinous substances around the eye, requires a pupil. And how do those things, a retina by its own has no particular evolutionary function, they will argue. So you don't get half an eye or half a liver. The whole thing has to happen simultaneously or it just doesn't work, right? So this is irreducible complexity. And again, because it's so unfathomably improbable, and I will have spontaneously evolved with all of its different features by itself, that they argue that it must be a designer behind it. Okay, on the opposite side, so this is basically the conflict thesis on the religious and the anti-religious side. Now, on the opposite pole of this debate, there are a group of approaches which you can kind of cluster together as the harmony theses. And these tend to come in two different types. The first type argues that science and religion are separate from each other, and the second type argues that science and religion can work together. So they're integrated in various different ways. Now, the first of these approaches was described by Ian Barber as the independence model, but it's more popularly and famously known as the NOMA. So this is the non-overlapping magisteria, as was popularized by this chap here, Stephen Jay Gould, who was a paleontologist. And the argument here, as you can see in this quote from Gould, is that science and religion are entirely separate from each other. Completely independent spheres of life. As Gould puts it, the lack of conflict between science and religion arises from a lack of overlap between their respective domains of professional expertise. Science, in the empirical constitution of the universe, and religion in the search for proper ethical values and the spiritual meaning of our lives. In other words, science deals with how questions. How the hell does the universe work? How do all the different bits and pieces fit together? How do my slides keep going wrong every time I turn up and try to do one of these lectures? And religion deals with the why questions, right? So why are we here? Like, what is the meaning of life? Why is reality like this? Okay, they're dealing with completely separate questions to do with life and the universe and how everything works. And this approach is quite popular, and I think one of the reasons why it's quite popular is that it effectively ends the debate, because there is no debate once you get to this point. You say science and religion are separate things, that's it, right? There's nothing to argue about, there's nothing to fight about. You can simply carry on and get on with your life, so you don't have to think about all this kind of, trying to find arguments against each other and throwing sort of intellectual rocks at people and all that kind of stuff, right? You can simply go, yeah, they're separate things. Now let's do something a bit more interesting, right? On the other hand, some people on the religious side, so quite a few theologians, worry about this particular formulation because there is a sort of anxiety that, and I don't know whether or not this is worth being anxious about, but there is an anxiety that maybe science could one day cross over this barrier. Like, let's say, for example, if science discovered a center of moral reasoning in the brain, or if there was some kind of genetic explanation or cognitive explanation, and cognitive science is still, relatively young, but if in, 10, 50 years, scientists could work out exactly how moral reasoning took place, then this idea that morality was a non-scientific question would start to become challenged, and the sort of wall between science and religion as it's framed in the NOMA might start to collapse. So, partly for these reasons, quite a lot of theologians subscribe to the third and fourth models proposed by Barber, which are the dialogue and the synthesis models. And these argue that science and religion aren't separate, but instead they work together in various different ways. I'm not going to spend too long on this because this is a fairly, in the grand scheme of things, it's a fairly minority viewpoint. The biggest viewpoints that you'll find on this are the conflict thesis and the NOMA, but this is one that's just sort of worth knowing about, just so you're aware that it's there. The dialogue approach points towards shared interests between science and religion as a way of kind of bringing them together, right? So it might say something like science has proven that climate change, man-made, human-caused climate change is real and is a potential threat to life on Earth, or at least, the human side of it. So we better do something about it. And on the religious side, you might have the view that God gave humans stewardship over the earth, so the earth is ours to look after. So there is a shared interest here in avoiding climate change, so scientists and religious people can get together and sort of try to deal with this problem, right? That would be the kind of dialogue approach. The synthesis model goes even further and argues that science and religion can be integrated together. And a good example of this would be if you were talking about people's well-being, right? So obviously human well-being requires a sort of medical element to it. If you get sick, seeing the gaps in the audience, quite a few people have got freshers flu at the minute, I imagine. There we go, thanks for coughing. Perfect example. So you take medicine so you make yourself feel better, or if you need an operation, you go to hospital and the doctors come in and they kind of fix you in various different ways. That's the science part of it. But also, the argument here is that human beings require a bit more than this. They require a kind of spiritual, holistic approach to life, because there's more than just patching people up medically and sending them on their way. So a well-integrated program for individual well-being will include the spiritual dimension. And this would then feed over into policies, for example, that would say maybe we should have religious chaplains in hospitals and prisons, maybe we should have mindfulness programs on the NHS and these sorts of things, right? All good for your mental health and everything else. This would be science and religion coming together to provide an integrated solution. And that would be the synthesis model. Okay, so what then does the evidence say about all of this? Well, to discuss the evidence, I'm going to go through three different steps. First of all, I'm going to give you the views of scientists. Then I'm going to look at the views of the general public. And then thirdly, I'm going to look at the role of religiosity in the relationship between science and religion. So, the first thing here then, talking about scientists, is that most scientists tend to be non-religious, or at least less religious than the general population. Now, it is true that many scientists have been and continue to be religious. Galileo was religious. Sir Francis Bacon was religious. Sir Isaac Newton was religious, although he's not always the best example to use because he was a bit weird. And he was an alchemist. He used to keep a little stove boiling in his room at university, and he also used to poke needles in his eyes to conduct experiments about what would happen if you changed the shape of the eye. And what's going to happen to your vision? Oh, it goes blurry. You don't say. So yeah, I wouldn't rely on Isaac Newton. Einstein is another one that comes up a lot. Although Einstein was a deist, deism is where there is the belief that there is some kind of grand creator of the universe, but that it's not particularly interested in human affairs, doesn't engage in, doesn't interact with the world. It's a bit like a kind of genius painter. I don't know if I've given you this analogy in seminars before, so apologies if I'm repeating myself, who in their studio creates this kind of elaborate genius piece of work and then just leaves it and goes off to do other things, right? The deist God is not involved with human activities at all. And Einstein was a deist, right? It's a God that essentially creates the rules of the universe and then goes out for the rest of the day. So these people, you can find scientists that follow religion. Oh, so Francis Collins is another really great example. He's a devout evangelical and was head of the Human Genome Project, the international project to map the human genome till about 2008, I think it was. So you can find religious scientists. It is true. Most of these scientists who come up in these examples usually lived at a time when being religious was quite common and expected of people, or they tend to be the exceptions, right? So Francis Collins is kind of the exception in the kind of field of science. So here we go. Here's some actual facts and figures. This is a survey conducted by Pew in 2009, which found that 81%, this was looking at the United States, found that 81% of people in the general public in the United States expressed a belief in God, but the figure for scientists was just 33%. The survey also found that 16% of the general public described themselves as being atheist or agnostic or just nothing in particular, whereas the figure for scientists was 48%. So there's quite a big gap between the scientific population and the general public. Similar findings were produced by this was a worldwide study of scientists conducted by Eklund et al. in 2016. The general population are the lines in grey. The scientific population are the black lines. And as you can see, in every single country they looked at, with the exception of Taiwan and Hong Kong, scientists were less religious than the general public. However, it's worth just noting that scientists don't have a clear view on this issue, and this particular study also found variation of opinions amongst scientists about this relationship. And as you can see, most scientists did not subscribe to this conflict thesis. Even though they were less religious than the general population, they did not see science and religion as being in conflict. Most of them see science and religion from the perspective of the noma, right? Independent spheres of life, not overlapping, not contrasting, not conflicting with each other at all. There were variations here, by the way. So in the UK and the United States, and I think France as well, most scientists did see religion as being in conflict. But overall, globally, the figure was the other way. Okay, the second strand of evidence I want to give you here comes from the general public, and the view here is also a mixed one. So, on the one hand, there is evidence to suggest that the general public supports the conflict thesis. So here we come back to the topic of evolution. This is data from the United States. Gallup put out, I think they do this every 5 years or so, I haven't got the latest one, where they look at questions in the United States about people's views on evolution. And as you can see here, this is tracking it from the early 1980s. The grey line at the top is essentially the creationist view. This is the view that human beings were created directly by God. The black line at the bottom is the evolution by natural selection view. And as you can see, although there is a dip, it is true, from about 2013 in the creationist view, it still ends up hovering around about 40% of the general population in the United States, compared to 22% people who believe in evolution by natural selection. This is still huge numbers of people in the United States having completely different views on, and irreconcilable views, actually, on the relationship between religion and science. There's no way you can take the creationist view and the Darwinian view and put them, they just don't go together, right? It's like mixing oil and water. Similarly, research conducted by Pew in 2015 found that 59% of Americans felt that religion and science were often in conflict. This is the figure at the top, by the way. If you can see this, you should be able to see that okay on the big screen. 59% of US adults subscribed to the conflict thesis. The highest figures, if I can draw your attention to the middle of this chart, came from the non-affiliated population, i.e. the nuns, where 76% of people felt that science and religion were often in conflict. But this view was also came from a majority of Protestants and Catholics. 55% of Protestants and 55% of Catholics also said that they thought religion and science were in conflict. So again, it's a pretty sort of popular view. Studies beyond the United States, let's just skip across to this, have found varied results. So here is a chart from another study by Pew, which looks at the opinion of the general public in Central and Eastern Europe. And as you can see, opinions on the conflict thesis varies quite a lot. So you've got 74% of people in Greece, 73% of people in Serbia, 66% of people in Croatia who argue that, yes, science and religion are directly in conflict. But then as you come down this list and you get to the bottom, it's just 34% in Latvia and 29% in Belarus. So public opinion varies quite widely from country to country. And as we can see, just making the same point, although you might have to squint on this one, so I apologise for that. This is from a study by O'Brien and Noy in 2018, also found large variation in trust in science and religion between countries. Now, this is a horribly worded question, I think. The question was, what these charts show is the proportion of people who disagree with the view that there is too much trust in science and not enough trust in religion. In other words, the smaller lines, the smaller percentages, show people who want to have more trust in religion and less trust in science. So Chile, which is right at the bottom, is expressing the view that we need to have more trust in religion, whereas Sweden at the top is showing exactly the opposite, right? We should have more trust in science and less trust in religion. So again, you can find contrasting views between different countries. So public opinion is very, very mixed on this point. The final piece of evidence I wanted to draw your attention to today comes from the role of religiosity. And one of the key findings here, and again there are sort of variations, but it is a sort of general finding, is that higher religiosity is linked to more negative attitudes about the relationship between science and religion. And so studies in this area have produced a number of consistent findings, which is that people who have higher levels of religiosity tend to have lower levels of scientific knowledge, lower levels of trust in science, and are less accepting of what you might call religiously contentious claims. So this is where science would make claims about things like climate change or, abortion and the age at which life begins and things like this, right? The issues that are religiously contentious. So less scientific knowledge, less trust, and even less trust in the views on science on religiously contentious issues. So I'm going to go through some of these anyhow. The first is that this is a study by Esther Chan, which is from 2018. You might have to twist your head this time. I'm getting you to squint and twist your head, so you might end up with aching eyes and cricks in your neck at the end of the lecture. So I apologise for that. But this looked at the relationship between religion and science in 52 countries, and what it's showing you is the negative relationship in terms of religiosity and trust in science. So all of these, this was every single country in the sample, had a negative relationship. So all this is showing you is the scale of that negative relationship, right? So we get sort of, what have we had here? Algeria and South Africa on the left. There was a small negative relationship. So people who had higher levels of religiosity in South Africa and Algeria had a slightly negative view of trust in science. Whereas on the other side of the scale, you get to places like the United States, Iraq, Turkey, Romania, higher levels of religiosity in those countries were strongly linked to negative trust in science. So the general finding then is that higher levels of religiosity do produce a negative relationship here, but again, the extent of this negative relationship does vary from place to place. And research into the link between religion and science also shows it varies according to the particular issue. So it varies from country to country, although there is this sort of general trend, but it also varies according to the particular issue at hand. And the idea of a conflict, as I intimated a couple of minutes ago, is strongest when we're talking about issues that are religiously contentious. These are issues that go directly to the core of a person's religious sense of identity, their sense of religious community, their sense of religious values, and so on. So fundamentalists like Ken Ham, going back to him again, will frequently dismiss the idea, and if you spend any time looking at, and there's loads and loads of debates on YouTube, religion versus science and all that kind of, and I do recommend you go and watch a few of them, because they are quite illuminating. Although once you've seen sort of 3 or 4, they tend to repeat themselves, and you tend to get the same arguments coming up again and again, and the sort of novelty of the experience falls off quite quickly. But I would advise you just to go and have a look at some of them at least, because one of the things you'll find is that the creationist side of the argument, people like Ken Ham, will say things like evolution is only a theory, right? It's just a scientific theory. And this is a sort of gross misrepresentation or a gross misunderstanding of what a scientific theory actually is. Because science never actually purports to prove anything. All knowledge is sort of, provisional until the paradigm changes and we end up with, new evidence and so on, right? So everything is a theory. Gravity is a theory, but, you don't see creationists trying to, jump out of their third floor window so they can get to wherever they want to go more quickly. No, because gravity works, right? Electromagnetism is just a theory. But creationists still use mobile phones, right? So the reason why they focus on issues like evolution is because these are the contentious ones that go right to the heart of their theological worldview, which of course in the creationist paradigm, let's say, is that everything was directly created by God. Or you'll find similar things about the age of the earth. And so, I mean, Ken Ham's, young earth creationist, it's 6,000 years old, right? So this is one of the things that you'll find, this idea that scientific claims are just theories. Now, this is really interesting because it goes into the political side of these debates. And again, if you do watch any of these debates on YouTube, what you'll sort of find is that a lot of times the debate is discussed in a very kind of intellectual way, like it's science is true, no it's not, religion is true, no it isn't, and they'll have arguments on one side and arguments on the other, and blah blah blah. And the kind of politics of this doesn't really come out, right? It's very often on these debates are treated as an epistemological issue. In other words, it's a question of which side has the best approach, methodologically, philosophically, and intellectually to understand reality. And so the argument then is usually framed in epistemological terms. Science is better than religion because it has the scientific method and we can get facts and figures and data and all of that sort of thing, right? So therefore science wins. It's an epistemological question. The thing is, though, and just leaving that to one side and not commenting on the rights or wrongs of that, but there is also a sort of political dimension to these debates that, as I say, often gets overlooked. And the political side of it is because this argument between science and religion, yes, it takes place on a sort of intellectual level, but on another respect, it's not an intellectual argument. It's an argument about power between different competing groups. And so one of the reasons why people with higher levels of religiosity have a high levels of distrust in science isn't really because, they kind of know in detail the scientific method and they're aware of the philosophical limitations of it and that kind of thing. They have a distrust of science because there is an anxiety there that if scientists start to make all these claims about reality and they know how everything works, they might then start to make pronouncements and become involved in public policy debates on issues that will touch upon religiously contentious areas. So scientists might say, we've worked out when life begins, and therefore we're now going to cross over into debates about sexual reproduction, abortion, and all the rest of it, right? And so this is the reason why a lot of this distrust in science comes about. It's not because of the intellectual arguments, it's because they don't want scientists coming along and becoming involved in public policy matters that will ultimately undermine the role of religion, okay? Or undermine their sense of religious identity. So one of the really interesting things about the debate between science and religion on the political dimension is that it's all about the way in which science and religion are framed. So supporters of the conflict thesis, these are the new atheists, but we'll talk more about these in a few weeks, they frame religion as being propositional. If you remember back to the first lecture, we were talking about this propositional view of religion. They will say that religion makes truth claims about the world. Remember Victor Stenger, sort of about 25 minutes ago, with his God, the failed hypothesis? You can treat religion as a scientific hypothesis, you can measure it against the scientific evidence, and then religion loses. And so because religion loses, from this perspective, there's no good reason to believe in religion because science can disprove it. So therefore, anybody who believes in religion must be irrational. And if you're irrational, you're dangerous, right? Because you can be persuaded to believe all kinds of stuff, right? And so from this particular viewpoint, framing religion as propositional, this doesn't just have intellectual consequences, this has real world consequences because then religion becomes framed as a problem, and a problem that needs to be solved, right? It's simply impossible to believe that Jesus came back from the dead, or that the earth was made in 7 days, or that miracles happened, because science can disprove it. Therefore, if you believe that, there's something weird about you, and you're a threat to the social order, and so, we need to deal with that. So that's how religion gets framed. And science is then framed, of course, as being, rational and intellectual, and, it's all about evidence-based, and it's sort of neutral, right? Critics of the conflict thesis, or supporters of the harmony thesis, reject the view that religious claims should be taken literally, right? If you remember, again, going back to lecture 1, I gave you a quote from somebody called Karen Armstrong, who said, religion is not about believing 50 propositions before breakfast, it's about the values and the meanings and the relationships that you have in life. So they completely reject this idea that religion is propositional. Religion is not making truth claims about the world. You've completely misinterpreted, you've missed the point. The only people who see religion as being propositional are new atheists and fundamentalists like Ken Ham, right? They're the only people who believe that the Bible is literally true. And you can find Muslim examples of this as well. Most people will say it's allegorical or it's metaphorical or it's trying to teach us something about meanings and values and the purpose of life. It's not meant to be taken literally, right? And so from this perspective then, science is framed as something that is, or certainly in the new atheist view of what science is kind of overstepping the mark, right? So again, it's about how religion and science are framed in these debates in terms of this power struggle. And this has real-world consequences. Oh, I've already told you this. I've messed my slides up again, so I'm getting slightly ahead of myself. There we go. There's irrationality. There's religion as a positive force. Yeah, so people like Karen Armstrong will say religion is a good thing, right? It gives people a sense of purpose in life, brings people together, helps to create morality, which we'll see more about next week, and so on. Okay, it does have actual real-world consequences beyond this sort of level of debate and framing, and we can see this in two of the biggest events that have happened. Well, one of them is still happening. In the case of climate change and COVID. So for instance, where are we? Again, yeah, this is, if you look into the literature on these topics, there are obviously variations, right? I'm giving you the kind of general picture here. So when we get to climate change, most work in this area has taken, or most research in this area has taken place in the United States. So yeah, there are questions about the generalizability of this research. Not a lot of research, for example, in the Muslim world on climate change. Some of the evidence from the Muslim world tends to say that yes, Muslims agree that climate change is happening, but are kind of less interested in dealing with climate change because Muslim countries tend to have high levels of poverty, lower levels of development, and so on, and so there's a greater priority put on those particular issues, which is slightly strange, maybe, or at least ironic, let's say, because people who live in vulnerable populations, parts of the world that are most likely to be affected by climate change over the course of the next few years. So there is some evidence from outside the United States, but most of it comes from the US. What we have in terms of the evidence is that yes, there are quite a few religious individuals. I wouldn't like to put a kind of percentage on it, but there is, it's quite a substantial proportion who do argue that climate change is real, climate change is taking place, and we are obligated as religious individuals to do something about it because God gave us the earth to look after. We have a duty to look after it. We can't mess this up. And so, because of their religious beliefs, they are involved in trying to deal with climate change. You can completely find people on the religious side whose religiosity leads them to try to stop climate change getting any worse, right? That is absolutely true. On average, though, there is little evidence that religion itself or religious groups are starting to move towards becoming greener, okay? And what we tend to find is that higher levels of religiosity are linked to less concern for the environment. This is particularly the case when you get to the fundamentalist side. Less willing to change behavior, have a greater belief that God controls events. So this is kind of, doesn't matter what we do, it's all in God's hands, so, whatever. And also, as we've discussed the course of the past few minutes, higher levels of distrust in scientific policies designed to prevent or mitigate at least the effects of climate change. So, from the propositional view of religion, sort of new atheist view then, religion in these kinds of contexts gets presented, I was saying a few minutes ago, as a problem. Religion in these cases isn't just a problem, it's dangerous, right? Because if, there's quite a lot of religious people in the world, if they take the view that climate change is out of our hands and something we can do about it, and I don't really care anyway, then that is something that needs to be dealt with, but, that's a big threat to the future of human civilization. On the other hand, the Karen Armstrong type view, this is the view that religion is not propositional and it's all about values and beliefs and so on. That approach will see religion as being not part of the problem but part of the solution, because religious leaders have, there's quite a lot of religious people, so if you get them on side to help deal with the problem, that's a huge plus. But also religious leaders have quite a lot of influence, and so if you can bring religious leaders on board, and if they can start talking about climate change and the need to deal with it, they can help to persuade and influence other people. So that, again, how science and religion are framed in these debates has an actual real-world knock-on consequence in terms of climate change, right? If we look at it propositionally, religion is a threat, it's a danger. If we look at it in terms of values and relationships and everything else, the kind of, what you'd call it, non-propositional worldview, then religion is a positive force for good in dealing with these problems. And we get a similar situation in respect of COVID. So there's quite a lot of research into COVID, and there's quite a lot of research outside the United States as well. And again, this is a general kind of picture. You can find examples where religiosity had a positive effect. One of the areas here, for instance, there's a sort of literature on mental well-being during the pandemic. And one of the findings there is that people who had high levels of religiosity tended to have high levels of better levels of mental health, generally speaking. So, there is a kind of variation here, but in general, higher levels of religiosity during the pandemic was found to be linked to having less trust in science. Higher belief in conspiracy theories, this is like, Bill Gates with his 5G masts and all that sort of thing, being less willing to follow safety guidelines. So this was being less willing to follow social distancing, less willingness to wear masks, more likely to put trust in the power of faith to solve the COVID crisis, and less likely to obtain a vaccine. So let me just quickly wrap this up, give you some figures here. These are figures from the United States. Now, as you can see, the highest highest section of the US population that obtained a vaccine was the atheist section. 90% of atheists expressed their willingness to obtain a vaccine in 2021. This was even higher than the religiously unaffiliated in general, which came in at 75%, and the lowest part of the population were the white evangelical Protestants, with 57% willing to get a vaccine. So again, from this propositional viewpoint, you would look at this and say religion is potentially a public health danger, but from the Karen Armstrong approach, you would say this is an opportunity for religion to be a great force for good, because if religious leaders can persuade their congregations to get involved and go and get a vaccine, this can have huge public health benefits. In fact, there was one final slide. Let me just finish this off. This was an example of the way in which religion was instrumental in various places in helping to spread COVID, because one of the things that religious believers had in this case was going to church or going to the mosque or taking part in religious festivals. And they didn't just want to give that up when COVID came along. We'll talk more about this when we get to digital religion, by the way, because a lot of it did end up moving online. But there was one particular church in Shincheonji in South Korea, and this was in March 2020. This just one place was responsible for 5,000 COVID infections, which at that particular point was more than half of all COVID infections in South Korea. So when we talk about the COVID pandemic and the COVID crisis, there was also a very strong religious link there as well. So I am mindful that I have, because I started a little bit late, trespassed on your time and gone slightly over. So I'm ending it there. Thanks, everybody, as usual, for turning up. Have a good week, and I'll see some of you in a minute, and I'll see the rest of you later on in the week.